And I think we're good. I think we're recording. Welcome to today's class. It is a video today. I'm going to try and make it as, the same as possible. But essentially, we're still talking about emergence today. And of course, the next reading is pretty specific, right? You'll see that actually on the core syllabus, there was like a three-part um, reading, right? So you didn't have to, of course, read everything in the chapter. But of course, we're talking about really these emergent models and what do they mean? Are they scientific? Are they just social theory, right? And things like that. How do they apply to architecture? And why is it important to understand people, right? Especially if we're going to be architects and we, of course, design for people, we design for the environment, we design for a lot of different avenues. It can be highly complex. So you can imagine how this subject of emergence starts to connect with architecture, right? And why it's so important for architects today to understand that. But just diving right into it, let's take a look at what we're going to see today. See, share my screen, desktop one. Yes, allow for 1 month. So anyway, we have some notes. And of course, let's jump to the syllabus. Hopefully you can see this in the recording. If not, we're just taking a look at the syllabus. And of course, we're on week 8 this time. So today we're talking about the myth of the Ant Queen, pages 32 to 38, 48 to 53, and 63 to 67. And I do want to point out some of the sort of ending markers because that kind of ends randomly halfway during the page. And it is kind of worth your time to get the other paragraph as well. But just to summarize and break it down for us today, and maybe I stop screen sharing on this one. Maybe I just leave it up. Not a big deal. One of the first models we're actually talking about is the Ant Queen model. So diving right into page 32 to 38. Stephen Johnson starts to give us kind of his recollection, if you will, of kind of what happened between him and Gordon in the science lab, and of course figuring these things out. Now, what's very interesting about an ant queen is, at least in the past, we used to think that the queen was actually in charge, that there'd be basically that she was delegating orders and all the ants would basically just follow down, and they thought it was more of a top-down behavior. Now, of course, it wasn't until we started really analyzing these ants, at least according to Gordon and Stephen, that we started to have a new outlook, a new theory about what's happening between the complexity and the information that's going on along with ants. And I do find that pretty interesting because there's a lot of scenarios, at least in science, where we actually compare ourselves to ant colonies sort of, migrating and then spreading, migrating and then spreading, creating anthills, structures. Ants are actually pretty incredible. They can lift 6 times their weight, or even I think like 100 in some species of ants. And like I was mentioning last time, there's even a lot of really interesting social science on ants, specifically with the different species and colonies of ants, whether they like each other, whether they don't. So there is a lot of interesting information. But to boil down this emergence for this model, it does start to become an interesting discovery because it would start to change the way that we look at species or systems and even our own, such as, how are humans working together, right, instinctively. And of course, we get this a little bit from Stephen Johnson. I'll show a video actually where he starts talking about the reactions to 9/11 in 2001 and where he thought the city would basically shut itself out. It kept going, right? And there was a good sense of camaraderie. So he points that out, maybe not so much in our reading technically, but of course he did some TED Talks and we won't watch those in the video today, but of course I'll share actually a couple of videos with you guys today so you can view them on your own time. But yeah, she starts to point out some particular things, on page 32. And really I start reading this chapter from the beginning. Otherwise I'm like, who's this Deborah Gordon? Um, so I like the way he, breaks it down as a story, um, and starts to basically go about the hypothesis of why they were even looking at ants in the first place. And again, it's because we've always kind of thought there was this top-down situation, really kind of mimicking really the power structure of what we have currently, right? With pacemakers being the police systems, the government systems in place, and really just this hierarchical order, right, to our behavior. Anyway, getting to it. Um, yeah, for Gordon, basically, we cover the nest, red plastic, because some species of ants don't see the red light. So they really start getting into the minutia of what they were testing. But I like to point out, one of the favorite experiments that they start talking about is definitely the one where she starts talking about the anthills and the specific placement of the cemetery and the trash for this ant queen model. Now, if you're familiar with an ant farm, and basically it's like a glass plane, right, that you can see through. And she was, of course, understanding the complexity of um, how they arrange things, right, in their ant colonies. So, of course, starting to take measurements and certain distance measurements between certain locations in that ant farm. And what was pretty interesting is that, over the many times that, looking at these ant farms, that there was a proportional relationship between the components of the ants, right? So, like, for instance, um, regardless of the size of the ant colony, right? Because she would do this in a big piece and a small piece, that the mathematical ratios between the cemetery, the main cabins, and of course the trash all had a mathematical ratio that once upon looked at that information, realized there was a correspondence, right? There was a pattern, if you will. And that's definitely something we look for in emergent systems, at least according to Stephen Johnson, that there seems to be these underlying patterns of either math or proportion, very akin to architecture, right? And if there's something that we can, of course, obtain from that, that possibly we could be more organized, more self-efficient, maybe healthier. So there could be a lot of benefits to mimicking some of these biological attributes, right? So of course, that's why looking at the ant queen model is so interesting. But yeah, it definitely goes into the story of it, the questioning of it, and maybe some of the factors that resemble why an ant colony and the ant queen model actually resembles emergent behavior particularly well. However, on page 32 to 33, um, this is where they start talking about how it relates to humans, which, maybe brings us to our second model, which is, of course, the Manchester model. Maybe some of us know about Manchester, UK. So I've actually went ahead and pulled it up. And what's particularly significant about the Manchester model, at least in terms of emergence, is that we're told, at least throughout history, but there was no pacemakers, there was no police system. In fact, there wasn't a government established until, at least according to this book, 100 years later, after its establishment, right? Which is particularly interesting. I mean, how does anything get built? How did we delegate things on our own? Now, of course, he starts to mention that it did definitely become start this poor and rich situation, that the poor would obviously take care of things, obviously for a mutual benefit of some kind, but it was generally the more well-off that was making a lot of the decisions. So, not much has changed there. But interesting enough, if we take a look at Manchester, we don't get that grid that, that we're most familiar with, like say New York or even in our own city, San Antonio, where I'd say San Antonio kind of has a blend between both of those, both an orthogonal grid path, but also organic, right? Especially with like 410 and 1604 going around our grid systems. But specifically in the Manchester model, it's pretty organic, right? Pretty whack, as they say, in terms of organization. And there's quite a rich complexity because of it, right? And even the way that it urban sprawls and of course, grows is particularly interesting. It's chaotic, especially compared to some of the other cities. But interesting enough, starts to dive into the facts that Manchester between 1700 and 1850, which is 150 years, also created a new kind of city that literally exploded into existence, according to Rasmussen. The statistics on population growth alone capture a force of that explosion in 1773. Again, keep in mind maybe some of the other historical factors, such as the French Revolution going on and maybe the aftermath of that, people leaving certain areas, and finding sort of word of mouth. Hey, where are you guys going? Hey, I'm going over here. I have a buddy who told me about this place called Manchester, where there's no government, and of course everybody is sort of this libertarian mentality, right? Hey, you don't bug me, I don't bug you, we're good, right? And let's see how long that can go. But as you can imagine, it's sort of this word of mouth. And in fact, some companies even today, myself included, rely on the word of mouth, sort of an emergent property of people sharing information at a lower level rather than a top-down commercial from, say, a Super Bowl ad. Anyway, hopefully that's making some sense. But interesting enough, we have this Manchester model where it starts to show us that humans were representing emergent behavior, right? In this case, it happens to be the design of a city, specifically Manchester. And taking, of course, a look at the book, you know, Stephen Johnson says it captures Inglis' acute powers of observation. But I quote from the length because it captures something else that is well difficult to think about in models of self-organization. To imagine a world without pacemakers, right? Without people in charge, without people sort of standing up and going, hey, everybody, we should do it this way. That there seems to be sort of this agreement, right? There's these natural tendencies. And I was explaining it last time that, the power of many definitely affects the individual. I was explaining last time how, even in social experiments where everybody's given non-alcoholic beer, it only takes that one guy to kind of act like he's drunk for the rest to feel intoxicated. It is a pretty interesting phenomenon that we empathize with the energy and the information around us, definitely in a social factor versus an individual factor. So you can imagine it on a massive scale, as much as a city, that it definitely starts to have an impact. And it's definitely a good idea that architects, especially ones designing cities, start to understand the individual versus the swarm of individuals. And of course, some of the benefits or negative factors that may come into play, um, which I think is pretty obvious, right? I mean, we see that a little bit even in that last video with Le Corbusier, right? He forgot about what it's like to have thousands of people you're living with, and one starts a party, how loud it is. So again, he could have probably learned from this emergent principle. Anyway, moving on, because from the Manchester model, of course, he starts talking about how this affects complexity overall and sort of ends it on page 36, or sorry, 38, um, with talking about basically that all the different things that this can apply to. Specifically, he starts talking about Jane Jacobs, which of course I have a video for us today. I won't play it right now, but of course I'll share it with you. It's very brief, and starts to explain Jane Jacobs maybe a little bit more than that index presentation we saw. Because she is a social figure, not a designer or architect, but a huge component for why we establish cities with a little bit more character towards people, right? It is we the people in a sense, and that definitely seems to be a generating factor in American life. So, of course, Jane Jacobs' book, The Death and Life of American Cities, definitely makes a lot of sense to what she's talking about. How does it work specifically in America? And what are some of the contributing factors that, of course, she would say it is this complex emergent system or emergent behavior. So the word complexity definitely comes up a lot in architecture. We see it in Robert Venturi, a famous architect for really tackling that idea of complexity in architecture. And to be fair, in my opinion, I think humans have actually always strived for that wonderful artistic complexity that we find in classical architecture. Again, actually, it relates a lot to electricity, music, cymatics, which we'll talk a little bit about next time. And of course, I have some good videos with that because we find that nature is inherently an emergent property, right? That we find this the more and more that we dive into things, we don't just find it in ants. We don't just find it in slime mold. We find it in everything. We find it in species across the earth. We find it um, just about everywhere. So, of course, it makes a lot of sense that humans are, of course, doing the exact same thing. And we're not so different from the animal kingdoms as we at least thought in the 1950s science. However, Jane Jacobs is a really good resource in terms of starting to discover what it means to be in those things. The next topic that I think also relates, at least specifically towards architecture, is this idea of a smart city. Now, some of us may have heard of a smart city, with 15-minute cities, the fact that climate change, we're wasting too much material, too much energy, or too complex. We need to actually simplify. Now, I don't want to, start a debate of whether we need 15-minute cities. Do we need to get rid of our cities? Do we just need smart technology? Nobody's allowed to drive, and everything is basically automatic and driven by robots and artificial intelligence. I don't know, but I definitely think it's a question that our generation will be tackling in the next 30, 50 years. So again, you heard it first in your intro to architecture class, right? That there's these huge, bigger social issues that are going on because of technology. Is it here to help us? I think so. And of course, if it used appropriately, I think could really benefit society. So I don't want to just throw it out, and I don't think we should just completely start integrating it. There has to be a delicate critical thought for it. And I do think it's going to be our architect students, you guys, that of course shape those decisions for the future. So it's important, right? And using it basically for design. Can we make better, efficient designs that are happier, rich in complexity and art, but maybe not bankrupting us as a society? That would be probably a good idea. Now, of course, we hear from Smart City, and I love this guy. I should know his name by now, but he makes a lot of incredible videos. So I'll go ahead and attach that one too, but not to waste our time, at least on this video. So far we have the Ant Queen model. We have a Manchester model, and they both have their significance and play for what they add to the emergent behavior, at least according to Stephen Johnson. Now, lastly, Stephen Johnson basically starts talking about how this applies to um, the digital realm, right? Because, he's talking in 2003 and he's heavily interested in the internet, as you can tell just by the way he's writing. So, we just talked about 32 to 38, 48 to 53. Now let's jump to 63 to, uh, honestly, 68. Yeah, so actually, sorry, I missed a couple of notes in 48 through 50. He does start talking about the digital model, right? And how this would actually start to play into things. How would we sort of start to realize that this order of complexity, how do we even look at it? How do we analyze the data, if you will? And of course, starts talking about how the computer is a huge component of that, not only in the Ant Queen model, especially in starting to simulate some of these programs to essentially mimic nature, right? So he starts talking about star logo. He starts talking about, of course, Alan Turing again, and that the computer came at a very perfect time to, of course, solve these complexity issues of being able to simulate something millions of times, right? So I just wanted to actually show what that looks like, of course, with Star Logo, right? Something like this, and I'll kind of have it just playing in the background as we go, but something like this starts to be really important now. In this case, it's just ants dropping off food and building and things like that. But as you can see, we start to get a third person view, right? We get to make all these situations, right? And we no longer have to even use the ants. We don't have to make a city to understand some of these larger concepts. In fact, we can model it with the computer. In this case, three-dimensionally. Now, of course, in the book's case and Alan Turning's case, it was all zeros and ones. Of course, looking at the math behind some of these very complex systems, adding two minus one, adding two minus one, that's a very simple equation. But as soon as you get to add five, add eight over here, add six, but minus five, minus two, minus three over here, right? It can start to get extremely complex. So I don't really want to have to share this one. Again, it's much more of a visualization. So you can start to kind of get a feeling of what we're looking at here, the patterns that we're trying to study, seeing that this ignorance is very useful, right? And of course, a little bit later on, Stephen Johnson starts to break down exactly some of the patterns and characteristics, if you will, of an emergent behavior system, right? At least in his own words. However, of course, there's a good little bit on page 40, 48 and 49. But moving on, right, at least on page 51, that's where we get, of course, Jacob's death and life of the American cities. The kind of problem a city is, right? I think that's a really great line for um, clearly all the issues that we would have. And then, of course, the egotistical issues between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs, where Jane Jacobs was really standing up for a lot of people, really all of the components of that emergent system. And Robert Moses really standing for this top-down behavior. No, I say what it is. I'm the city planner and I want to destroy New York City, in the lack of a better term. And of course, Jane Jacobs standing up to that. So, I mean, when was the last time you heard an ant go, "Hey, we don't want this," right? So it is really interesting that we see humans again showing this behavior. So again, just not to backtrack too much, but before we move on and talking about cybernetics, he ends cybernetics on page 53, talking about what is this organized complexity? What does it mean? What does it mean for Jane Jacobs? What does it mean for the ants? So on and so forth, right? And is, of course, trying to understand this scientifically. Now, maybe I mentioned this in last class. I'm not sure if I did or didn't, but there's a difference between pseudoscience and science, right? Of course, we can look it up ourselves, but pseudoscience is information not based on evidence, right? So in terms of Jane Jacobs, she's technically pseudoscience. It's technically a social theory because science is actually the study between a cause and effect relationship, right? Not geometry, not mathematics, not proportion, right? Uh, don't get me wrong, a lot of us accidentally just say colloquially science, but natural science is actually highly specific and happens to do with a hypothesis of a natural phenomenon. Now, it's really hard to tie a natural phenomenon to human behavior because, again, there's so many factors, there's so many variables. You can't even make a control variable because we don't have a normal person, to be fair. What does that even mean? So, as you can imagine, this starts to become a little bit pseudoscience or what we refer to as social science, which again isn't natural science because natural science is a cause and effect relationship. We need an IV and a DV, an independent variable and a dependent variable. And that, again, is really hard to do um, with social science, right? So as you can imagine, we start to make these theoretical models. Right now, there's nothing wrong with a theoretical model. It's just be careful. It doesn't mean that that's fact, right? It just means that there's a correlation. Now, correlation doesn't mean causation. Again, so not to make this into a science class, but I just want to say Stephen Johnson, I think he does a really good job of separating those things, but definitely has a way of making it a very nice story, right? So I don't want to get us too confused with, architecture, science, art, what does it all mean? So anyway, jumping to page 63. So to kind of end it for us. Yeah. He starts with actually Mitch Regnick's computer simulation of slime mold behavior, which we just saw. And of course, he started to simulate the two variables, right? So understanding the AMP forces or the trail that was basically left behind of pheromones. We even do this as humans, right? I've even mentioned to the class, if you want to find the best partner, you actually smell them. Your senses of smell are actually telling you a lot about the genetics of somebody that we found through social pseudoscience. Again, nothing wrong with pseudoscience, but because it can lead to interesting theories and maybe stuff that we can prove one day in terms of natural phenomenon. But interesting enough, we start to model those individual mold cells, right? Particularly in slime mold and the ant queen model. So we start to have this paradigm shift. Now, if you don't understand what a paradigm shift is, it means a lot of people are going to experience cognitive dissonance because what they thought was true has been discovered not actually true. And we see this happen all the time. In fact, wouldn't be surprised that it actually starts conspiracy theories, Anyway, not to get into that topic, but it is kind of interesting. Why do people have um, this distrust or trust towards science and scientific discovery? Well, they might be accidentally looking into a, a pseudoscientific model, right? That does explain certain aspects of reality, but not in a scientific way because there is no IV or DV. Anyway, not to get too much into the minutia, but I do like the way Stephen Johnson starts talking about really the birth of the computer and the intellectual development of these new ideas and how they were spreading and changing the paradigm of what we thought in natural science. Like I said, we used to think that everything was this top down or that there was this code, if you will, a God in the complexity of things, almost like a God particle. Quantum physics is again tackling the same question. There seems to be, hey, if all this stuff is created, that would imply there's a creator. Cakes don't bake themselves, now do they? So again, this huge question of how did we get here seems to be the underlining foundation of all of this, right? Which again is kind of the human construct. And again, in my opinion, something that you may never know, and that's okay too. Anyway, not trying to get too philosophical. But it does end pretty well. He starts talking about Sim City, and again, that's why I bring up the smart cities, because I do think that starts to bring this all together uh, particularly well. And of course, we get to see what does it mean for emergence today, right? And how we're looking at this digital model. For instance, I started talking about Airbnb, Uber, Tinder, all these digital platforms that are actually using algorithms based on emergence behavior, right? And of course, the pattern seeking, all these different things to, of course, make something new, make something more efficient, make something better for society. Now, of course, it would be the architects, the engineers, the designers that are using this information, these modeling to make society better. Now, arguably, we could debate that. Is it making it better? Is it making it more stringent? Are we losing liberties? Are we not losing? Are we gaining some? Again, the debate continues for sure. But interesting enough, the whole digital realm is based on this emergent property. ChatGPT and AI isn't actually artificial intelligence. It's a huge database of information and then, of course, being quickly retrieved with a quantum computer. And then, of course, relayed to a regular computer, such as what me and you have. But it does it so quickly that it appears like artificial intelligence. But again, it's starting to be a really big question in our society. How do we use it? How safe is it? And of course, how do we combat some of the, sort of the bad things that could happen, such as cyber attacks? And of course, this video starts to dive into some of those issues that we have with these complex emergent systems. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing for now and get back to the video. Yep, still recording, thank goodness, because I don't want to say that all over again. But again, hopefully we start to see that some of these systems are really important to architecture and how they affect architecture and society, and how we can actually use that to either stray away from some of the top down. Maybe we can start to realize that our designs themselves are starting to be too top down. They need to, of course, come from the many so that we can make society happy. After all, we definitely hear it from society when we make an ugly building, right? they start to tell us at least the first 6 months, and then maybe the next 18 months, they're like, no, we really like it. Keep the Eiffel Tower. We know it was just for the World's Fair, but we actually do want to keep it because, well, now it's iconic. Now it's a part of our culture and our city of Paris. So already, just examples throughout history. So just to recap, we have the Ant Queen model, we have the Manchester model, and we have the digital model. And to be fair, all of these, of course, kind of correlate with each other. But you know me, I like to kind of give a hint to what will be on the next quiz. It is just one question again, and it'll definitely be over one of those three models. You'll have to pick one and, of course, explain how it relates. The question being, what is the emergent behavior shown in the quote unquote model? So you'll need to pick one and, of course, explain why it's important to society. Now, again, very opinionated, and I've left this quiz opinionated on purpose. However, that doesn't just mean I believe this and that's true. Use the evidence from the book or from Stephen Johnson to, of course, strengthen your argument or back up your statements, right? Some of you guys are really picking up on that on your quizzes particularly well, and hopefully seeing an increase objectively in your grades. Some of you, again, I appreciate the honesty, but please get the book, please start reading, or borrow it from a friend, that kind of thing. Make the best out of a situation. Other than that, of course, continue reading, and I will see you next week. Of course, thank you, Professor Risen, for taking care of you guys today. And of course, you'll hear from Professor Tobin Hayes on Wednesday to distribute the quiz. And of course, we'll hear from the index presentation. Now, I've asked her to at least record the audio. And actually, to be fair, maybe the student is responsible for this, just an audio recording or video, whichever is easier, could just be shared with me, right? So that I can view it as well. And again, I apologize for not being available this week, but we'll get right back on track uh, week 9, right? So of course, this is week 8, I believe so. Anyway, otherwise, if you have questions, feel free to let me know in Canvas. I am still available. I still have my stuff. So reach out if you do have questions. Otherwise, signing out, and I will see you guys next week. Thanks, guys.